Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. We are talking about the Fadaail of the Sahaba, and we're on the chapter of the Fadaail of Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas. The next narration from Mus'ab ibn Sa'ad from his father, Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, who says that Allah Jalla wa Ala revealed some ayat of the Quran regarding him, meaning regarding Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas. When he embraced Islam, his mother Sa'ad took a vow that she will never talk to him until he renounces Islam, and she took a vow not to even eat or drink. She said to him that Allah commands you to do well to your parents, and I'm your parent, so I command you to renounce your faith. So 3 days passed, and she was in this state, and she fainted because of the extreme hunger. She began to curse Sa'ad, and Allah Jalla wa Ala revealed the ayah, وَوَصَّيْنَا الْإِنسَانَ بِوَالِدَيْهِ حُسْنًا وَإِنْ جَاهَدَاكَ عَلَىٰ أَنْ تُشْرِكَ بِي. We have ordered man to do well to his parents, but if they strive to make you commit shirk, up to the end. And the ayah says, وَصَاحِبْهُمَا فِي الدُّنْيَا مَعْرُوفًا, and treat them well in this world. So this was one ayah. And the second ayah which he speaks about was that he says there was some spoils of war for the Prophet, and there was a sword amongst them. I picked it up and came to the Prophet and said to the Prophet, نَفِّلْنِي هَذَا السَّيْفِ, grant me this sword as a spoils of war, and you know my state. But the Prophet told him, رُدَّهُ مِنْ حَيْثُ أَخَذْتَهُ, return it from where you took it. So he went back to try to put it down, but he was so desirous of it, and came back and asked the Prophet the same question, the same request. And the Prophet said to him in a loud voice, return it where you took it. And in response to this occasion, Allah Jalla wa Ala sent down the ayah, يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْأَنْفَالِ, up to the end. They ask you about the spoils of war. And he mentions a third occasion. He says, I fell ill and sent a message to the Prophet. The Prophet visited me, and I said to the Prophet, permit me to distribute in charity as much wealth as I want. And the Prophet did not agree. I said, permit me half of it, and the Prophet did not agree. And then I said, permit me a third of it. The Prophet kept quiet, and then thereafter permitted a third as being the maximum amount. Sa'ad also reports another occasion. He says he came to the Ansar and Muhajirun, and they said, come, let us serve you khamr. And this was before khamr was made haram. There was presented to them a roasted head of a camel and a water skin containing wine. He says, I ate and drank with them. He says, I said, the Muhajirun are better than the Ansar. And to that a man picked up a portion of the head of the camel and struck me with it, and my nose was injured. I informed the Prophet about that, and Allah Jalla wa Ala revealed the ayah, إِنَّمَا الْخَمْرُ وَالْمَيْسِرُ وَالْأَنصَابُ وَالْأَزْلَامُ رِجْسٌ مِّنْ عَمَلِ الشَّيْطَانِ. That khamr and gambling and sacrificing on stone altars and seeking a decision by firing arrows, these are all impurities of the works of shaitan. So in this lengthy narration, let us summarize. We are given 4 occasions. The first one about treating your parents well even if they are mushrikun, but just not obeying them if they force you to commit shirk or any type of kufr or any type of disobedience to Allah Jalla wa Ala. The second occasion was about the spoils of war. They belong to Allah Jalla wa Ala and the Messenger. The third occasion is not a particular ayah, but it is a ruling, a very vital ruling, which is that the wasiyah can be maximum of a third for those people who have inheritors. And the fourth matter about the vital prohibition of khamr, because it incites enmity amongst people. Look how one of the Muslim brothers of Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas took a camel's head and struck him and injured his nose. And this was under the influence of khamr, where you lose your inhibitions and you do not think the way a sane person would think. Also in the chapter, Sa'ad himself reports, we were 6 men in the company of the Prophet, and the mushrikun would say to the Prophet, drive these 6 men away, so that they may not become overbold or overconfident against us. He says, these 6 men were I, meaning Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, and Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and a man from the Fadaail tribe, Bilal ibn Rabah, and 2 other men whose names I do not know. Sa'ad says that the Prophet began to think about whatever Allah Jalla wa Ala wanted him to think about, and then Allah revealed, وَلَا تَطْرُدِ الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ رَبَّهُمْ بِالْغَدَاةِ وَالْعَشِيِّ يُرِيدُونَ وَجْهَهُ. And do not drive away those who call upon their Rabb by morning and afternoon, seeking His face. We find from this narration that the mushrikun did not want to associate themselves with the lowly type of people, meaning the lower class, as they were too proud. And perhaps the Prophet felt tempted to banish them so that he could have access to the mushrikun and give da'wah to them. But Allah Jalla wa Ala told the Prophet to get his priorities in order. The Muslimun have priority over the mushrikun, who are not likely to embrace Islam anyway. Let us take the next chapter about the Fadaail of Talha and Az-Zubayr radiyallahu anhuma. The first narration from Abu Uthman, he says, in some of these days in which the Prophet fought, no one remained fighting with the Prophet except Talha and Sa'ad. So in this narration there's an evidence that Talha and Sa'ad were loyal, remained with the Prophet, even prepared to die fighting for the Prophet. Also in the chapter, the Prophet said, لِكُلِّ نَبِيٍّ حَوَارِي وَحَوَارِيَ الزُّبَيْرِ. Every Prophet has a helper, and my helper is Az-Zubayr. Az-Zubayr here is Az-Zubayr ibn al-Awwam, the son of Safiya bint Abd al-Muttalib. Safiya, of course, the aunt of the Prophet, so Az-Zubayr will be the Prophet's cousin. He embraced Islam at about 15 years of age, shortly after Abu Bakr. He migrated to Habasha and also from Mecca to Al-Medina. So he was involved with 2 migrations, and he always participated with the Prophet in the battles. And he is one of the Al-Asharatul Mubashshara, and was also appointed as one of the 6 members of the council to choose the successor of Umar ibn al-Khattab. As for Talha ibn Ubaidullah, he embraced Islam about the same time as Abu Bakr, so he was one of the early Muslims. He was sent in a secret military mission to Syria just before Battle of Badr, and he returned too late to partake in the Battle of Badr. But during the Battle of Uhud, he was one of those fighting by the Prophet and saved him and protected him. Also in the chapter, Az-Zubayr said that the Prophet addressed me by saying, Fidaka abi wa ummi. May my father and mother be sacrificed for you. We mentioned in the previous narrations about the Fadaail of Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, the Prophet said that to him, and now he is saying this to Az-Zubayr ibn al-Awwam. Like we said, this is an expression of love. The actual meaning per se is not intended, rather it's an idiomatic expression expressing love. Also in the chapter, Abu Hurairah reports that the Prophet was on the Mount Hira and it began to move. The Prophet said, Uskun Hira, stay still, O Hira, فَمَا عَلَيْكَ إِلَّا نَبِيٌّ أَوْ صِدِّيقٌ أَوْ شَهِيدٌ. For there only stands on you a prophet or a Siddiq or a Shaheed. And at that time on Mount Hira there stood the Prophet, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali, Talha, Az-Zubayr and Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas. So the Prophet is the Prophet, obviously. The Siddiq spoken of is Abu Bakr, and as for the Shaheed, then they were the rest of these men, Uthman, Ali, Talha, Az-Zubayr and Sa'ad. Well, we know that Umar, Uthman and Ali, these 3 Khulafa, were killed without due right. And the one who's killed without due right, meaning out of dhulm, he is a Shaheed. As for Talha and Az-Zubayr, they were also killed without due right. Az-Zubayr was killed in the Battle of the Camel by one of the followers of Ali, who thought that Az-Zubayr is fighting against him, whereas in reality, Az-Zubayr wanted to leave this battle because he felt it was unjust. And as for Talha, then similarly, An-Nawawi says that he was leaving the Battle of the Camel and an arrow hit him, thus killing him. So both Talha and Az-Zubayr died whilst leaving this unrighteous battle of the Camel, because it was against the Khalifa, Ali ibn Abi Talib, and a battle against the Khalifa is not righteous, and they were leaving this unrighteous battle, but they did not make it. Radiyallahu anhuma. So the one who is killed unjustly is a Shaheed, but not in this life, in the Akhirah. In this life the Shaheed will be the one who dies in the battlefield fighting to make the word of Allah Jalla wa Ala the highest, and he is killed by the enemy. Now the name of Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas is also mentioned. If this wording is authentic, then Al-Qadi Iyad says, as reported by An-Nawawi in his commentary, that Sa'ad is a Shaheed because Jannah is witnessed for him. So it's mashhood, and Allah Jalla wa Ala knows best. Also in the chapter, Aisha reports that both Abu Bakr and Az-Zubayr are from those about whom Allah speaks, الَّذِينَ اسْتَجَابُوا لِلَّهِ وَالرَّسُولِ مِنْ بَعْدِ مَا أَصَابَهُمُ الْقَرْحِ. Those who responded to Allah and the Messenger after misfortune had befallen them. So this narration is also further testimony to the loyalty of Az-Zubayr and his integrity to the Prophet and to Allah Jalla wa Ala as well. The next chapter about the Fadaail of Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah radiallahu anhu. Anas ibn Malik reports that some people from Al-Yaman came to the Prophet and they asked him, "Send with us a man who will teach us the Sunnah and Islam." Whereupon the Prophet took the hand of Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah and sent him with them, and he said, "هذا أمين هذه الأمة." This man is the trustworthy one of this ummah. We take from this vital narration the importance of learning the Sunnah. So not just the Quran, but the Sunnah as well. And in this then, there is evidence against those who say that we will just take the Quran and ignore the Sunnah because it is not of the same level as the Quran. And this madhab is kufr outright. As these people said, they wanted to learn the Sunnah and al-Islam. So in this case, the Sunnah cannot be the same as the Quran. And we learn of the great fadila of Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah. His name was Amr ibn Abdullah. He was one of the early Muslims and participated in the Battle of Badr. Umar sent him as the leader in the campaign to Syria, and he was appointed as the governor of Syria, and he died in Syria in the 18th year when he was 58 years old. He is one of the blessed al-Asharatul Mubashara, the 10 given glad tidings of Jannah. And interestingly, it is because of this very hadith that Umar ibn al-Khattab said that had Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah been alive, he would have appointed him as the Khalifa after. So it would not have been Uthman, the third Khalifa would have been this man, Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, had he been alive when Umar passed away. Because Umar wanted to appoint a trustworthy man as the Khalifa. The Prophet himself gave Abu Ubaidah the tazkiyah. That is to say, he vouched for Abu Ubaidah himself that he is the trustworthy one amongst this ummah. The next chapter about the Fadaail of Al-Hasan and Al-Husayn, from Abu Hurairah, that the Prophet said about Al-Hasan, "Allahumma inni uhibbuhu fa'ahibbah wa ahbib man yuhibbuh." Oh Allah, I love him, so you love him too, and love the one who loves him. So in this narration there is a fadila of Al-Hasan in that the Prophet loved him. And that is a fadila or a virtue enough. In another narration in Sahih al-Bukhari, it mentions that the Prophet said, "I love them both. Inni uhibbuhuma." So based upon that, he's talking about Al-Hasan and Al-Husayn, both his grandchildren from his daughter Fatima. Another narration in the chapter tells us that the Prophet came riding on a white mule, and Al-Hasan and Husayn were sitting, one in front and the other behind him. But again, it gives us this idea that the Prophet was very close to his grandchildren. The next chapter about the Fadaail of the Ahlul Bayt. Aisha reports that the Prophet went out one morning wearing a striped cloak of black camel's hair. There came Hassan ibn Ali, and the Prophet wrapped Hassan under the cloak. Then came Hussein, the Prophet did the same thing. Then came Fatima, and he took her under the cloak. Then came Ali, and he took him under the cloak. And the Prophet recited, إِنَّمَا يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ لِيُذْهِبَ عَنْكُمُ الرِّجْسَ أَهْلَ الْبَيْتِ وَيُطَهِّرَكُمْ تَطْهِيرًا. Allah only wishes to remove the impurity from you, O people of the house, and to purify you thoroughly. We can take from this narration, first of all, that you can wear black clothing, because the Prophet here was wearing black clothing, as the clothing was made out of the hair of the black camel. In the ayah, the impurity spoken of is the impurity of sins, and it has been said that a rijis, translated to impurity, is every action that is deemed to be ugly or sinful. Note also that the ayah that the Prophet recited came in the context of the wives of the Prophet. Yet in this narration, none of the wives are mentioned. It was just Ali, Fatima, and the Prophet's 2 grandchildren. So it means that the Ahlul Bayt are the wives of the Prophet, but also Ali and Fatima and Hassan and Hussein. So the point being that we have to look at the generality of the words of the Quran, not the specificity of the context. The next chapter about the merits of Zayd ibn Haritha and Usama ibn Zayd, his son, radiyallahu anhuma. From Salim ibn Abdullah, he reports from his father, who said that we were in the habit of calling Zayd ibn Haritha as Zayd ibn Muhammad, that is, Zayd the son of Muhammad, Muhammad the Prophet, ﷺ, until Allah Jalla wa Ala revealed, "Ud'uhum li'abaihim huwa aqsatu 'inda Allah." Call them by their fathers' names. This is more equitable with Allah. The background to Zayd ibn Haritha is that he was taken prisoner while still a child in a tribal war. He was sold as a servant to Hakim ibn Hizam, who was Khadija's nephew. He was then given to the Prophet as a present. The Prophet freed him and adopted him as a son when Zayd was 8. At that time, adoption was allowed, and so he became known as Zayd, the son of Muhammad ﷺ. The Prophet at that time, though, was not a prophet. He was one of the early Muslims, one of the early followers of the Prophet. He was first married to Zaynab bint Jahsh, who was the Prophet's cousin. He divorced her later on, and Zaynab bint Jahsh married the Prophet. Then later on, he married another woman, an Abyssinian, by the name of Ayman. She bore him Usama ibn Zayd. Zayd participated in many battles, and he fell in the Battle of Mu'tah. As for his son Usama, who was titled Hibbur Rasul, the beloved one of the Prophet, he died in the year 54, during the reign of Muawiyah. We learn from this narration that it is not permissible to take a name other than the name of your father, even if it was permissible during the early days. Also in the chapter, Ibn Umar reports that the Prophet ﷺ appointed Usama ibn Zayd as the chief of a military expedition, and there were people who objected to Usama being the leader of the army. The Prophet stood up in response to this and addressed the people, saying, "In tat'anu fi imratihi faqad kuntum tat'anuna fi imrati abihi min qabl. Waymullah in kana la khaliqan lil imra wa in kana lamin ahabbi an-nasi ilayya wa inna hadha lamin ahabbi an-nasi ilayya ba'dah." If you object to his leadership, you objected also to the leadership of his father aforetime. By Allah, he was fit to be a leader, and he was from the most beloved of men to me. And verily this one, meaning Usama, is from the most beloved people to me, after him, that is to say, after Zayd. This military expedition that the Prophet prepared was right at the end of his life. In fact, he did not get the opportunity to see the success of the Muslims because he passed away before that. The expedition was to go up towards Syria, but we learn the vital lesson from the narration that both Zayd and his son Usama were from the most beloved of all people to the Prophet, and that in and of itself is a great fadilah. We also learn to give a public address in enjoining the good and forbidding the evil. It was not permissible for the people to object to the Prophet's decision. مَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ وَلَا مُؤْمِنَةٍ إِذَا قَضَى اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ أَمْرًا أَن يَكُونَ لَهُمُ الْخِيَرَةُ مِنْ أَمْرِهِمْ. The people are not allowed to have a choice when Allah and the Messenger have decided a matter pertaining to the Sharia. And so it is upon the people of knowledge to step up and publicly declare that which is correct and that which is wrong. The next chapter about the Fadaail of Abdullah ibn Ja'far radiyallahu anhu. Abdullah ibn Ja'far said to Ibn Zubayr, "Do you remember the occasion when we three, that is, Abdullah ibn Ja'far, Abdullah ibn Zubayr, and Abdullah ibn Abbas, so when we three met the Prophet, and he mounted us on his camel but left you?" And Ibn Zubayr said yes. "So why did the Prophet leave Ibn Zubayr and take Ibn Abbas and Abdullah ibn Ja'far along with him on the animal?" Well, because there was not enough space. Also in the chapter, Abdullah ibn Ja'far himself reports that one day the Prophet mounted me behind him on an animal, and he narrated to me a secret which I would never narrate to anyone from the people. We take from the narration that the Prophet was close to Abdullah ibn Ja'far radiallahu anhu. You would be if you're going to make someone ride behind you on the riding animal. As for the secret, what was it? Well, obviously we don't know, otherwise it would not be a secret. But the secret must have been something personal to Abdullah ibn Ja'far. It could not have been a matter of public interest, something that the Muslims need to know about. Because if it had been the case, then Abdullah ibn Ja'far would have narrated it, as you're not allowed to conceal knowledge. So this secret must have been something personal. And if that is the case, then there is no good in us knowing what it is, as it will not benefit us. It will not help us gain closeness to Allah Jalla wa Ala. The next chapter about the Fadaail of Khadija. Ummul-Mu'mineen radiyallahu anha. Ali reports that the Prophet said, خَيْرُ نِسَائِهَا Maryam bint Imran wa khayru nisa'iha Khadija bint Khuwaylid. The best of its women is Maryam bint Imran, and the best of its women is Khadija bint Khuwaylid. And Waqi' pointed with his finger to the sky and to the earth. So what this narration means is that during the time of Maryam, she was the best of women in the heavens and the earth. And during the time of Khadija, she was the best of women in the heavens and the earth. For any woman to be mentioned in the same breath as Maryam bint Imran is a fadila enough. These were the most virtuous of women during their times, and hence a role model for the Muslim women of today. Also in the chapter, Abu Musa reports that the Prophet said, كَمَلَ مِنَ الرِّجَالِ كَثِيرٌ وَلَمْ يَكْمُلْ مِنَ النِّسَاءِ غَيْرُ مَرْيَمَ بِنْتِ عِمْرَانَ وَآسِيَةَ امْرَأَةِ فِرْعَوْنَ وَإِنَّ فَضْلَ عَائِشَةَ على النساء كفضل الثريد على سائر الطعام. Many men acquired perfection, but no women acquired perfection except for Maryam bint Imran and Asiya, the wife of Fir'aun, and the virtue of Aisha over the other women is like the virtue of tharid over the other types of food. The tharid was bread soaked in meat broth and sometimes served with vegetables. The Prophet preferred this over other types of food. With the exception of Ibrahim, who was born to Maria, the Prophet's concubine, all of his children were born to Khadija. So his firstborn was Qasim, and the Prophet was given the kunya Abul Qasim. He died in infancy. His other son Abdullah also died in infancy. His son from Maria, whose name was Ibrahim, also died in infancy. So all three of his sons dying in infancy. Then his daughters, all born to Khadija. Zainab, she died in the 8th year, before the Prophet. Ruqayya, she died at the time of the Battle of Badr, again, well before the Prophet. Kulthum, she died in the 9th year, again before the Prophet. And finally, the only child of the Prophet to survive him was Fatima, and she died just 6 months after the Prophet. It should be noted that Maryam and Asiya were not prophets, though they were righteous people. The problem with this narration is that it does not even mention Khadija, yet it is in the chapter of the Fadaail of Khadija. It would be better under the chapter of the Fadaail of Aisha, and also in it there is Fadaail of Maryam and Asiya. However, there is no doubt about this next narration. Abu Hurairah reports that Jibreel came to the Prophet and he said, Ya Rasulullah, هذه خديجة قد أتتك معها إناء فيه إدام أو طعام أو شراب فإذا هي أتتك فاقرأ عليها السلام من ربها عز وجل ومني وبشرها ببيت في الجنة من قصب لا صخب فيه ولا نصب. O Messenger of Allah, this is Khadija, she is coming to you. She is carrying a vessel with her which contains condiment or food or drink. When she comes to you, recite to her the salam from her Rabb and from me, and give her glad tidings of a house in Jannah, made of hollowed pearls, in which there is no noise nor toil. This hadith means that it is permissible for us to testify Jannah for Khadija bint Khuwaylid. Not just that, but Allah Jalla wa Ala sends His salam specifically to Khadija, as she was a pillar of support for the Prophet during a time when the Prophet was most vulnerable. We may take from this that it is permissible to convey your salam to someone else, if you are unable to do it directly. Also in the chapter, Aisha reports, she says she never felt so jealous of any of the wives of the Prophet as she did with Khadija. Even though I did not meet her, whenever the Prophet would slaughter a sheep, he would send some of the meat to the friends of Khadija. She says, I got angry one day and told him, Khadija, meaning you are remembering Khadija? And the Prophet said, Inni qad ruziqtu hubbaha, I have been granted her love, or it could translate to her love has been nurtured in my heart. We take from this narration the honesty of Aisha. She plainly admits that she was jealous. Normally, when people are jealous, they will not admit it, because it is a defect. Jealousy is a defect, no doubt, and no one really wants to admit their own defect. But here Aisha radiallahu anha is being extremely brave in admitting her defect of jealousy. We find from this narration that even beyond the grave, Khadija had an influence on the Prophet, that he would even send the meat of a slaughtered sheep to the friends of Khadija, keeping good relations with them, and his love for her not waning in aught. Also in the chapter, Aisha reports that the Prophet did not marry another woman whilst he was married to Khadija. And this is another virtue of Khadija, in that the Prophet never married against her, so that Khadija did not have to share the Prophet with another wife. Also in the chapter, Aisha reports that Hala bint Khuwaylid, the sister of Khadija, sought permission to enter upon the Prophet. Hala would remind the Prophet of Khadija, and upon seeing her, the Prophet said, Allahumma Hala bintu Khuwaylid, O Allah, it is Hala bint Khuwaylid, as the Prophet was extremely joyous. Aisha says, she became jealous, and she said to the Prophet, why do you remember an old woman of Quraysh, of red gums, that is to say, her teeth are falling off, so no whiteness of the teeth in the gums, just pure red, and one who is long dead, and Allah has given you someone better than her, referring of course to herself. Well, what can we say? These are fierce words, and if anyone other than Aisha had spoken them, his days would be numbered. But the fact of the matter is that Aisha radiallahu anha at that time was young and immature, and also being a female, therefore having this natural trait of jealousy, these words can be understood and overlooked in her case. So at that time Aisha had not acquired the foresight, tact and breadth of vision which she displayed during the latter stages of her life. The scholars often ask who is better, Khadija or Aisha, and perhaps the balanced answer is that when it comes to helping the Prophet during times of distress, Khadija is superior, no doubt about that. But when it comes to disseminating knowledge of the Sharia, Aisha has the virtue. This is the best of what has been said on this matter. The next chapter about the Fadaail of Aisha, Al-Mu'mineen radiyallahu anha. Aisha reports that the Prophet told her, I saw you in a dream for 3 nights, when an angel brought you to me in a silk cloth, and he said, here is your wife. And when I removed the cloth from your face, behold, it was you. And I said, إِن يَكُ هَذَا مِنْ عِنْدِ اللَّهِ يُمْضِي. If this is from Allah, then He will make it come to pass. We find from this narration that Allah Jalla wa Ala married Aisha to the Prophet by way of a wahi, revelation in his dream. In a similar fashion, how Allah Jalla wa Ala married Zainab bint Jahash to the Prophet by way of revelation in the Quran. We also need to know that the halal and haram is in the hands of Allah Jalla wa Ala, because many kuffar will say that the Prophet married Aisha when she was 6 years old, and this is immoral. That is going to be their basic argument. First of all, in Islam we have no concept of morality. Let that much be clear. Rather, there is only ahkam of Allah Jalla wa Ala. That which is halal, that which is haram. That which is mashru', legislated, that which is ghayr mashru', not legislated. That is the language we speak. Not this nonsensical language of morality, or that which is immoral or amoral, or any other useless, hollow words. Secondly, this marriage is sanctioned by Allah Jalla wa Ala, as you can see that the dreams of the prophets are a wahi, a revelation, and it is Allah Jalla wa Ala who has conducted this marriage. Whether she was 6 or 60 makes no difference. The only point is that Allah Jalla wa Ala sanctioned it, and no one else has a say after that. Also in the chapter, Aisha reports that the Prophet said to me, I can discern when you are pleased with me and when you are annoyed with me. Aisha says, I asked him how, and the Prophet said, when you are pleased with me, you say, La wa Rabbi Muhammad. And when you are angry with me, you say, La wa Rabbi Ibrahim. No, by the Rabb of Ibrahim. Aisha replied, Ajal, yes. Wallahi, Ya Rasulullah, by Allah, O Messenger of Allah, Ma ahjuru illa smak. I do not abandon except your name. When a husband and wife recognize their rights for and against each other, and realize that their marriage is a means for them to draw closer to Allah Jalla wa Ala, that is the ultimate aim in their marriage, then even during those times when the relationship turns bitter, as it inevitably will do from time to time, you are still able to maintain balance even in your anger and even in your bitterness. This is the beauty of a marriage in which both the spouses see their marriage as a means of drawing closer to Allah Jalla wa Ala. The evidence is this narration. Aisha says that she only ever abandons the name of the Prophet, so she will never abandon the Prophet himself But the worst it can ever get during times of anger is that she will leave out the name of the Prophet. That is it. That's the worst it's going to get. And this is the beauty of a balanced mentality. And this balanced mentality is easily attainable for the one who studies the Kitab al-Nikah, the book of marriage, and the ahadith pertaining to marriage. We can also take from the narration how close the Prophet was to Aisha, in that he could notice these subtle changes in Aisha's speech, indicating whether she's happy with him or angry. We also notice Aisha makes mention of the Prophet's name, La wa Rabbi Muhammad, but we know you're not allowed to call upon the Prophet using his name, as you would call upon anyone else. So what about this narration then? Well, the answer is that Aisha, when she said La wa Rabbi Muhammad, is not calling upon the Prophet. Rather, she is using the Prophet's name in a third person sense. And that you are allowed to do. What you're not allowed to do is to call upon the Prophet directly using his name. Rather, you have to say, Ya Rasulullah. Also in the chapter, Aisha reports that the other wives sought equity from the Prophet in terms of love and affection, because they knew that the Prophet loved Aisha more. And so they sent Fatima to demand this equity. And the Prophet told her, do you not love the one whom I love? Fatima said yes. And the Prophet said, I love this one, meaning Aisha. Then thereafter, Fatima returned to the rest of the wives. The wives told her to go back and speak to the Prophet again, because this is not the answer we desire. And Fatima refused to go again. So they sent Zainab bint Jahsh, another wife of the Prophet, who was closest to Aisha in the eyes of the Prophet. And she was a pious woman and very charitable. She spoke to the Prophet and she started to speak harshly to Aisha and started to lay one into her. Aisha looked at the Prophet to see if the Prophet will give her the opportunity to reply back. And she felt that the Prophet did not mind if Aisha defended herself, and so she did so. To which the Prophet smiled and said, this is the daughter of Abu Bakr. The main lesson to be taken from this narration is that the other wives knew that the Prophet had more love for Aisha, and so that's why they demanded equity. Otherwise, the Prophet was equal when it comes to spending the time equally with them and spending on them equally. He was equal in that regard. But when it comes to whom you love more, then you do not have as much control in your heart as you do with other financial matters. And so the man cannot be blamed if he loves one wife more than the other. Also, we can take that you are allowed to speak harshly back to someone if they are speaking harshly to you, or if they are criticizing you, you can defend yourself. Also in the chapter, Aisha reports, during the Prophet's last illness, he inquired, Aina ana al-yawm? Where am I today? He asked. He said this desiring to be with Aisha. She says, when it was my turn, Allah Jalla wa Ala took him, meaning gave him death, and his head was between my neck and chest. The reason why the Prophet is asking this question is because he is not allowed to transgress against the other wives. If it is the other wife's turn, he's not allowed to give it to Aisha except with her consent. When the other wives knew that the Prophet is desiring Aisha, they gave their turn to Aisha. And so in this narration, yes, again we find that the Prophet loved Aisha more than the other wives. We may take from the narration that the Prophet is a human being because he fell ill. As Allah Jalla wa Ala says, قُلْ إِنَّمَا أَنَا بَشَرٌ مِثْلُكُمْ يُوحَى إِلَيَّ. Say, I am only a man just like you. And this is a rebuttal against those who say that the Prophet is more than a human, he's made out of light, and he does not have a shadow, like when the sun hits him, he does not cast a shadow on the ground, and all this type of excessive aqidah. We take from the narration that the Prophet is dead, because this is the illness from which he died, and we have other narrations which make it explicit that this was the illness in which he died, and those narrations are also coming up. The words mata fihi, he died in it, meaning in the illness, these words are explicit. And again, it's a rebuttal against those who say that the Prophet is alive, he is with us, he's looking at us. And again, this is an extreme view. It is excessiveness, just like the Christians about Isa alayhi salam. Allah teaches us, وَمَا جَعَلْنَا لِبَشَرٍ مِّن قَبْلِكَ الْخُلْدِ أَفَإِن مِتَّ فَهُمُ الْخَالِدُونَ. We have given no man before you everlasting life. So if you die, will they live forever? And of course, we already dealt with the narration of Abu Bakr, who gave the news to everyone that the Prophet is dead, explicit. They may even make claims that they have seen the Prophet during their celebration of the Prophet's birthday and so on, approving of their bid'ah, or something along those lines. Well, what they have seen is the shaitan. But one might say, shaitan cannot take the image of the Prophet, can he? The answer is no, he cannot take the image of the Prophet, which is why these people who claim to have seen the Prophet think that they have seen the Prophet. So the vision they have seen is the vision of shaitan. And they, meaning these people, the misguided ones, are thinking that it is the Prophet, whereas the shaitan has not appeared in the image of the Prophet. Meaning to say, all these descriptions of the Prophet that we know of, shaitan has not assumed that appearance. But rather the only thing which is happening is that they think that they are seeing the Prophet. So it is just a delusion on their part. Those who say he is alive, they come with the flimsiest of evidences. They say that the shuhada, those who die fighting in the way of Allah, they are alive, as the Quran teaches us. So if that's the case, then it should be even more so the case with the Prophet, who is better than any shaheed. And this is a nonsensical argument. It makes no sense whatsoever for anyone with a modicum of common sense. The shuhada are dead. There's no doubt about that. That is why you bury them. How can you bury a person who is alive? But where they are alive is in the barzakh period. And yes, so is the Prophet alive in the barzakh period. We have no qualms with that. The issue at hand is this world. In this world, the shuhada are dead, and the prophets are dead as well. And all people who die are dead. This really ought not to even be a debate. But when the shaitan plays tricks with you and has your neck in his grips, then the man who claims Islam will go to all sorts of extremes in his aqidah. وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ. Allah Jalla wa Ala says, بَلْ أَحْيَاءٌ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِمْ يُرْزَقُونَ. Nay, they are alive with their Rabb, being provided for. So notice, with their Rabb. If they are with their Rabb, that means they're not in this world. It has to be the barzakh period. Okay, here's a question. If a man is on his deathbed and he has 4 wives, is he allowed to spend his last breaths with a particular wife whom he loves more than the others? The answer is yes, as long as it is by the consent of the other wives. We also take from this narration the virtue of the wives of the Prophet in that they gave precedence to the Prophet's desire over their own desires. Also, Aisha reports that the Prophet said, لم يقبض نبي قط حتى يرى مقعده في الجنة ثم يخير. Never did a Prophet die until he saw his place in Jannah and then he was given the choice. That is, the choice to live or die. She says, when the Prophet's head was on my lap, he fainted, and then he regained consciousness, and he stared up towards the ceiling, saying, Allahumma ar-rafiq al-a'la, O Allah, with the highest companions. Aisha said, at that time I knew he is not going to choose us. It's also reported that the Prophet recited the ayah, مَعَ الَّذِينَ أَنْعَمَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِمْ مِنَ النَّبِيِّينَ وَالصِّدِّيقِينَ وَالشُّهَدَاءِ وَالصَّالِحِينَ وَحَسُنَ أُولَٰئِكَ رَفِيقًا. He recited this when he was in his illness with Aisha. It would then appear to us that this was the last ayah of the Quran that the Prophet recited before passing away. Also in the chapter, Aisha reports that when the Prophet set out on a journey, he would cast lots to see which of his wives will come with him. She says one time it was the turn of Aisha and Hafsa. Both of them went with the Prophet on the journey. During the night time, the Prophet would travel with Aisha on the camel and would talk to her. Hafsa suggested to Aisha, why don't you ride on my camel and I ride on your camel, so we can have each other's experience? And they agreed to that. So it happened that the Prophet at night came to the camel on which Aisha was supposed to be riding, and he greeted her and rode on the camel, not knowing that it was actually Hafsa on that camel. When they alighted, Aisha missed the company of the Prophet and she began to feel jealous. She put her foot in the grass and said, O Allah, let the scorpion sting me or a serpent bite me. As far as the Prophet is concerned, I cannot say anything about him. We find in this narration a strange type of jealousy that Aisha implements. She puts a foot on the ground, asking Allah to send a scorpion to sting her foot or a snake to bite it. This is out of the anger of the jealousy that she felt. Firstly, she missed the company of the Prophet, and secondly, she must have felt that Hafsa has got her one up over her. Is it permissible to make a dua such as this? The answer is no. You do not make a dua against your own self. As the Prophet ﷺ explicitly said, When Abu Salama passed away and his family members were crying, and the Prophet said, do not make dua against yourself except in goodness. And also the hadith which is coming up about a man who said that, oh Allah, if you're going to punish me with anything in the akhirah, bring it now, in this world, so as to get it over with. And he became severely ill, and the Prophet rebuked him for this. He told him, you will not be able to bear the punishment of Allah. You should have asked him, رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنَةً وَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ. As far as Aisha's dua is concerned, she did not really mean it, but rather it was said out of this jealousy. So it was not a dua that was actually meant from the heart. Also in the chapter, Aisha reports that the Prophet told her that Jibreel sends the salam to you. And Aisha says that I replied, wa alayhi salamu wa rahmatullah, and upon him be as-salam and the rahmah of Allah. We know from the previous chapter about Khadija that Allah Jalla wa Ala sent salam on her and Jibreel also, and in this narration Jibreel sends salam on Aisha. So the point is that you can convey your salam to somebody via a proxy. And in this there is a fadila of Aisha radiallahu anha. Also, if the salam is conveyed to you via a proxy, then you ought to reply just as normally you would reply directly. And this is what we find Aisha radiallahu anha doing. In fact, authentically in An-Nasa'i, a man conveyed to the Prophet the salam from the man's father, and the Prophet said, wa alayka wa ala abika salam. May salam be upon you and to your father. So you reply with the salam to the conveyor and to the one from whom it is being conveyed, both people. Okay, just another point of benefit about the dream that the Prophet had of Aisha being his wife when she was uncovered from the silk cloth. The Prophet said, if this is from Allah. Now, if this dream was before his prophethood, then there's no problem. The Prophet could not have known that this is revelation from Allah Jalla wa Ala. However, if this was after his prophethood, then we know the dreams of the Prophets are revelation, so how can the Prophet be in doubt as to whether this is from Allah or not? And the answer to that would be that even though he says, إِن يَكُ هَذَا مِنَ اللَّهِ, if this is from Allah, the words are words of doubt, but the doubt itself is not intended. And this is permissible in the Arabic language, that you use words of doubt where doubt is not actually intended. And we have lines of poetry as well that support this idea. Also, Al-Bukhari uses this narration to prove that you're allowed to look at the woman you're proposing to, meaning before the marriage. But this istidlal is incorrect, because Aisha at that time was below the age of puberty, and such girls do not have an aura. And then besides, what happens in a dream does not translate to a ruling in reality. As we found in the dream the Prophet had about Umar dragging his clothing. Now that was okay in a dream, but that does not mean that you're allowed to drag your clothing in real life. That is from makhila, from self-conceit, which is haram. Let's just finish with some review questions. So question number 1. Recall what ayat were revealed in connection to Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, as mentioned in the narration, which we have covered. Question number 2. Are the wives from the Ahlul Bayt? Give the evidence which we have discussed. Question number 3. What is to be done if somebody conveys the salam to you on behalf of another person? How do you respond?